There are places in Los Angeles where nothing is written down, because nothing needs to be said, where deals were made and secrets kept, private, exclusive, the kind of room where powerful men spoke in low voices and everyone else disappeared into the background. It was sometime in the early 1960s. Frank Sinatra sat at a corner table, not alone. He was rarely alone, but surrounded by the kind of careful space that power creates. Members of his circle, associates, people whose livelihoods depended on reading his moods correctly. Something had gone wrong earlier that evening. A comment made, a slight perceived. The details are lost to time, but those who were there remember what happened next. Frank Sinatra went quiet. Not the quiet of someone collecting their thoughts, not the pause before an explosion. Something else, something colder. He set down his drink, leaned back in his chair, and looked at nothing in particular. The conversation around the table died, not because Frank had demanded silence, because everyone suddenly understood they were in the presence of something dangerous. When Frank Sinatra was angry, people lost jobs, sometimes careers. But when he went quiet, when that famous voice simply stopped, people lost sleep. The question no one dared ask that night was the one that haunted everyone present. Why did Frank Sinatra's silence scare people more than his anger? To understand the weight of Frank's silence, you have to understand who he normally was. Frank Sinatra was not a quiet man. His temper was legendary, documented, part of his mythology. He'd thrown punches at journalists, shattered glasses against walls, screamed at musicians, producers, directors. His voice, that golden instrument that could make millions weep, could also cut through a room like a blade. People who worked with Frank developed strategies for surviving his anger. You apologized quickly. You fixed the problem. You stayed out of his line of sight until the storm passed. His explosions were predictable in their own way. They had a rhythm, a beginning, a peak, an eventual subsiding. You could weather them if you were careful. Hollywood understood this. Powerful men had tempers. That was part of the territory. You dealt with it. You moved on. But silence was different. Silence meant Frank was thinking, calculating, deciding something that wouldn't be announced until it was already done. When Frank yelled, you knew where you stood. When he went quiet, you had no idea. And that uncertainty, that complete absence of information about whether you were safe or finished, that's what made grown men sweat through expensive suits. Those close to Sinatra learned to fear the quiet moments more than the loud ones. Because shouting was emotion, silence was strategy. And Frank Sinatra, beneath the swagger and the temper, was a deeply strategic man. No one checked the time. No one reached for their cigarette. The room stopped moving. That night, the people around Frank's table represented different levels of his world. A fellow entertainer, someone who'd worked with Frank for years. A younger performer hoping for an introduction. Business associates whose success was tied to Frank's goodwill. Staff who knew better than to interrupt. When Frank went silent, the change was immediate. The entertainer who'd been mid-story stopped talking. His sentence just ended, incomplete, hanging in the air. Someone reached for a glass, then changed their mind. The motion froze halfway. A waiter approaching the table sensed something and turned away without being told. It was as if the room itself had learned to hold its breath. Eyes found places to look that weren't Frank's face. The tablecloth, the wall, the bottom of a glass. Anywhere that didn't risk making contact with whatever Frank was thinking. Because that was the thing. No one knew what he was thinking. When Frank yelled, you knew he was angry. When he laughed, you knew he was pleased. But when he sat there, perfectly still, expression neutral, saying nothing, that was a void. And people filled voids with their worst fears. Had they said something wrong? Done something wrong? failed to do something they should have? The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, an eternity in a room full of people who made their livings through words and performance. Someone tried to restart the conversation, a careful comment about nothing important. It died immediately. Frank didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, just continued looking at something no one else could see. The most dangerous thing in that room wasn't Frank's temper. It was the way no one knew what he was thinking. And in Hollywood, where information was currency and perception was reality, not knowing was unbearable. There's a rule about power that most people learn too late. The person who speaks first loses. Not always, not in every situation, but in moments of tension, in confrontations where status is being negotiated, silence is dominance. Because silence forces others to fill the void, to explain themselves, to apologize for things they're not sure they've done, to reveal their hand. Frank Sinatra understood this instinctively, not because someone taught him, because he'd spent his entire life navigating rooms where he was either the weakest or the strongest person present. And he'd learned, when you're strong, you don't need to announce it. His silence worked because of who he was, the fame, the money, the connections, the carefully cultivated myth of the man who could end careers with a phone call. But it also worked because of what he feared. Frank Sinatra, beneath all the confidence and control, was terrified of humiliation, of being made small, of being reminded that he was Francis Albert from Hoboken, the skinny kid who'd clawed his way up from nothing. Every slight, real or perceived, was a threat to the image he'd built. And that image was armor, protection, the thing that kept him from falling back down. So when someone crossed him, Frank didn't just get angry, he assessed, calculated the level of threat, decided how to respond in a way that maintained his position. And sometimes, the most effective response was to say nothing at all. Because silence communicates something yelling never can. I'm so far above this that I don't need to engage. I'm so secure in my power that your opinion doesn't merit a response. I'll decide what happens next, and you'll wait until I do. Hollywood ran on implication, not confrontation, on favors and debts and unspoken understandings. Frank's silence was perfectly calibrated for that world. It said, I remember this, I'm noting it, and you won't know the consequences until they arrive. Back at the table, the silence continued. Someone, accounts differ on who, finally tried to address it directly, asked Frank if everything was all right, if there was a problem. Frank looked at him, not with anger, not with warmth, just looked, let the question hang there unanswered. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, Frank picked up his drink, took a slow sip, set it down with perfect control. Still didn't speak. The message was clear without words. I've decided not to dignify this with a response. I've decided you are not worth the energy of my anger. I've decided something, and you'll find out what it is later. The younger performer, the one hoping for an introduction, for a moment of Frank's attention that might change his career, quietly excused himself, read the room, understood that being present for whatever was happening was more dangerous than missing an opportunity. Others followed, not dramatically, not in a rush, just finding reasons to leave. Phone calls to make, early mornings, prior commitments suddenly remembered. Within 10 minutes, the table had emptied, not because Frank had ordered anyone to leave, because his silence had made staying unbearable. The man who'd been the original target of Frank's quiet displeasure, and everyone knew who it was even if no one would later agree on what he'd done, was left alone with his thoughts. No confrontation had happened, no words exchanged, no explicit threat made, just silence, and the crushing awareness that Frank Sinatra had noted something, had filed it away, had made a decision that wouldn't be explained or announced. That was somehow worse than any shouting match could have been. What happened next is harder to document, because nothing happened publicly. No headlines, no statements, no dramatic firing or public falling out. Just small things, quiet things. The man found that phone calls stopped being returned. Not all of them, just the important ones, the ones that might have led somewhere. An invitation to an event where Frank would be present, an invitation that had been expected, that should have been automatic, never arrived. A project that required Frank's approval stalled. No explanation given, just indefinite postponement. People who'd been friendly became cautious, not hostile, just careful. The kind of careful you are around someone who might be on the wrong side of someone powerful. None of it could be traced directly to Frank. No one could point to a moment where he'd said, "Don't work with this person," or "exclude this man." That wasn't how it worked. It worked through implication, through the understanding that Frank had gone quiet around someone, and therefore that someone was now a risk. And in Hollywood, associating with risk was something people avoided. The man's career didn't explode, didn't end dramatically, just slowed, plateaued. Opportunities that should have come didn't. Projects that should have happened quietly fell apart. And through it all, Frank Sinatra never spoke about it, never explained, never confirmed or denied anything. The silence that had started in that restaurant continued, indefinitely. A permanent withdrawal of attention that felt, to those who understood, like erasure. That's what made Frank's silence so effective. It didn't just communicate displeasure, it communicated that you had ceased to matter, that you'd been evaluated and found wanting, that you'd been dismissed not with anger, but with something worse, indifference. And indifference from someone whose attention could make careers was its own kind of death. Years later, those who'd been close to Frank would talk about these moments, not on the record, not in ways that could be traced, but in private conversations, in unguarded moments, the same themes emerged. When Frank stopped talking, one associate recalled, it meant he was deciding, and you didn't want to be what he was deciding about. Another put it differently. You could survive his anger. You'd apologize, he'd yell, eventually it would blow over. But you couldn't survive his disappointment. That was permanent. The silence was a form of exile, not physical. You could still be in the same room, could still exist in the same circles, but Frank's attention, his acknowledgement, his inclusion in the inner circle, that could be withdrawn. And once withdrawn, it rarely returned. This wasn't unique to Frank. It was part of the masculine code of that era. Men of power didn't explain themselves, didn't justify their decisions, didn't engage in lengthy discussions about feelings or intentions. They simply acted or didn't act, and everyone else was expected to understand what that meant. But Frank took it further than most, because his silence wasn't passive, it was active. It was a tool he wielded with precision. He understood that in a world of performers, people whose entire existence was built on being seen, being heard, being noticed, to be ignored by someone important was torture. And Frank, when he chose to be, could ignore you so completely it felt like you'd ceased to exist. Men who prided themselves on their toughness, their ability to handle conflict, their resilience, these men would lie awake at night after being on the receiving end of Frank's silence, wondering what they'd done, what it meant, what would happen next. The not knowing was the punishment, and Frank, whether consciously or instinctively, understood that. Frank Sinatra's life was defined by his voice, the instrument that made him famous, the sound that could fill stadiums and make intimate rooms feel even smaller. But the people closest to him knew a different truth. His silence was just as powerful, maybe more so. Because the voice, that was for the public, for the performances, for the millions of people who bought his records and saw his films. The silence was for those in his actual world, the ones who needed to understand where they stood, who needed to be reminded that access to Frank was a privilege, not a right, that his attention was something to be earned and could be lost. What did it cost him to live this way, to use silence as a weapon, to make people fear his withdrawal more than his anger? Those questions don't have simple answers. Perhaps it was protection, a way of maintaining control in an industry where control was everything. Perhaps it was insecurity, a way of ensuring people stayed in line because deep down, Frank feared they might not if given the choice. Perhaps it was just power, the kind that accumulates around certain people and changes them, that makes ordinary human responses, anger, forgiveness, explanation, seem unnecessary because power itself becomes the response. What we know for certain is that Frank's silence left impressions, not the kind documented in biographies or captured in photographs, the kind that lived in people's memories, in the moments they replayed, in the nights they lay awake wondering what Frank was thinking. Silence, it turns out, doesn't need to be broken to do its work. It just needs to be felt. And in those rooms, the private spaces where Frank Sinatra decided who mattered and who didn't, the silence was always, always felt. Frank Sinatra filled the world with music, with songs about love and loss and living on your own terms, songs that millions of people still listen to, still feel, still draw meaning from. But it was his silence that told the people closest to him who he really was. Not the legend, not the chairman of the board, not the voice that defined American music for half a century. Just a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all. Frank Sinatra knew how to hold a note longer than anyone else, but he also knew when to stop singing and let the silence do the damage.